Hi, I'm Sarah, and today we're sewing the Franconia dress by Cashmerette, which is part of their monthly Cashmerette Club membership program. You can learn more about how to sign up for the club at cashmerette.com/club or follow the link in the description. Let's get sewing. For my Franconia dress, I'll be using a lightweight cotton lawn. I'll be finishing all my seams with French seams, but you can finish yours however you like, and I'll give you little reminders throughout. You just need a few notions beyond the usual notions that you use while you're sewing, one of which is this elastic thread, and you're going to need 2 bobbins wound with this. You might need a little bit more, but 2 seemed like enough, and I'm going to show you exactly how to wind those when we get there. You're going to need some buttons when you're done, and you're going to want your favorite marking utensils. All right, let's get sewing. Before we begin, the preparation we need to do to our pieces is applying interfacing to our bodice front here at the placket and on our skirt all the way down from the waist to the hem. The next step we do before we start sewing is we're going to add a stay stitch to our back neck here and our front neck from shoulder to center. And you want to dial down your stitch length a little bit just for this. We're going to do this just on the inside of the seam allowance. Our first sewing step is to sew the shoulders. I'm going to be using French seams throughout, and if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. You can sew your seams right sides together and finish your seam allowances the way you prefer. So my first one here, I have my shoulders wrong sides together for a French seam. With the French seam, you always line up the seam right on the seam line, no matter how the raw edges line up. Always make sure that your seam line at the end and the beginning are lined up on the seam line, the full seam allowance, even if you're not using the full seam allowance on your first seam. And we'll do our other shoulder. I'll show you all the steps that I do with a French seam on this first pair of seams, and then after that, I'll just abbreviate the steps. So the next thing I do is I'm going to trim my seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch, since this total seam allowance here is only about 1/2. You don't have to trim all of it, just enough so that when you enclose your seam, you're not going to have any trouble catching all of it without any raw edge poking out. Next, I'm going to iron the seam any direction. Just press it at least one direction, nice and firm. So I'm pulling apart the seam with this hand so that it is nice and flush on the other side. You can press the seam open as well, but I usually just press it to one side. And then when you go to do this last press, it's going to want to fold right on that seam perfectly, because we pressed it the first time. It makes it a lot faster. All right, and so you want to stack that seam right on top of itself and press it really good. And remember, we need this beginning and the end to line up on the seam line, which originally was a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, now we're going to sew our last seam. And remember, line it up on the seam line there. Use your remaining seam allowance and sew your seam. All right, so that's our shoulders. All right, our next step is to sew the center back seam from neck to waist. I'm doing mine wrong sides together because of the French seam. All right, we have our center back seam. All right, next we're going to bind the neckline. So take your piece of binding, and we're going to do this. I'm going to show you a little trick on how to do this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to press this long edge here at the center front. We're also going to fold our neck binding piece wrong sides together in half. So handle this really gently. You don't want it to get stretched out. So we'll just fold this in half along the length of it. All right. All right, now we're going to fold back our placket right here at that V. And you can pin it if you like. Just like this. Lining it up along the raw edges of the neck. Just like this. Now we're going to lay our binding right sides together. Just like this. And just keep these raw edges lined up right here, just like this. And then that way we know that once this all turns to the inside, we're going to capture all of the binding inside the placket. All right, now we're going to sew this on here, 1/4 inch seam. Take out my pin. You want to go just to the left of your stay stitch. Make sure you press your shoulder seams towards the back. And we're going to go all the way around. If you've ever sewn binding with me before, you know that I usually gently stretch binding, but in this case you don't want to do that, not when it's the facing of for a finish. Be really gentle with it, don't pull it too much. All right, we're coming around the front here. All right, we're gonna cut that. I'm gonna trim this if you have a little extra. And let's make sure that I sewed all the way to the center front. So we can sew all the way to that center front fold. Just like that. All right, I'm gonna trim this down. Okay, we're gonna grade the seam here and we're gonna trim the bodice seam allowance down the most. So we're gonna make, basically when we grade seams, that we trim the seam allowances kind of in steps so that the bulk is offset. So we're going to trim the bodice layer. So we're going to lift up this binding. And this is the way I like to do it because this way I know I won't trim the other layer if I'm lifting it up out of the way and there's nothing else underneath it. You can do this with scissors too. Try not to get anything stretched out. Be really gentle with it. If your bias sort of stretched out in the sewing of it, try and steam it back into shape. Like I said, you really don't want to stretch that binding when you put it on. It'll be harder to do the next step when we top stitch it down to the bodice. All right, I'm going to clip the curve. I'll mostly focus in the curved area here. We're going to clip it. More clips, the easier this is going to be. It's okay if you have to go through your stay stitch. Okay, we're going to understitch this in a second, but one thing I find really helpful is before you do that is to press this in its final position, the binding in its final position, because it gives a chance for all these little edges to spread apart and get ironed in that position. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to push it that way. In fact, we can even press it so that the seam allowance is down. So we're just going to press this. So right now my binding is out from the edge like that. But I'm pushing the seam allowance underneath so that those little clips can spread apart. It's a two-part ironing step. Getting your binding to lay flat in a curved situation like this just takes a little bit of prep, but it's worth it. Otherwise, if you don't do some of these little steps, what will happen is your neckline will do this little funnel edge right here, and you don't want that on your pretty dress. Let's clip this. If you see some places you need to clip some more, make sure you do. Go all the way up to that sewing line.
All right, so now I'm going to press it towards the inside, and we can turn this placket now right side out, just like this. And we can just press all this at once. So fold it along your inner facing there, and along the fold line, there's a notch down here at the waist, just like that. And what I like to do is to kind of get this in its position, like let this curve be in the curve that it needs to be in. And we're gonna fold it to the inside, like this, and press it in shape. You might have some little edges sticking out, so you can trim those down. All right, now here's my back. And so like I said, I kind of get it nice and flat so that the neckline is in the curve shape that we want it to be. And then I fold that binding to the inside, really making sure that those clips are spreading apart, so we get a nice flat finish for this facing. Because this is essentially what it is. It's basically a facing. My seam allowance is a little off there. It's a little narrow. Okay, we'll do this last front here. We'll trim that. We'll trim these little seam allowance edges poking out because my seam allowance is a little off on this one right here. So it's a little narrow. So we'll trim that down at the sewing machine in just a second. And I'll show you up close. So here we're at this other front. So now we're going to turn it, poke out your point, fold it along the notch at the waistline. And this is the little trick. So now your binding is inside your placket there already. And we have this top edge sewn and looking nice and clean. Right now it's looking like it's actually going to lay nice and flat, which is really wonderful. So, all right, so now let's make sure we didn't miss anything or unpress anything along the way, like this little spot right here. And let's just take a look at our neck here. This looks good, nice and clean finished. All right, so let's finish. All right, so now we're gonna understitch. So we're gonna press the seam allowance towards the binding. And you see how I just turned this right back inside out, and we're just going to work on the seam allowance edge here. So we're gonna understitch this. And again, I like to form the neckline a little bit so that I get that nice curve. But right now, we really want to help our little clips stay splayed apart, right? So we're going to try and not close those together the best you can. Just kind of let them relax there. And I sometimes kind of, bend it a little bit so that it'll splay it. Kind of going against the neckline shape right now so that I get the most spread of those little clips so that when we fold it towards the bodice, they'll stay that way. I'm at the center back now. All right, so now we're gonna turn it to the inside, and if you want to give it another good press, go for it so you know that's laying nice and flat. And now we're going to edge stitch the binding on the inside of the neckline. And now when we're doing this, we're definitely making sure we keep this curve in its curved position so that we don't get that funnel shape and it gets nice and flat, all right? So we can incorporate sewing one of our plackets down right now, and we're going to start right here with our right front. So this is the wrong side of my fabric is facing up. This is my right front right here. And we're just gonna go straight up from the waist along this edge. And we're gonna turn at that corner right there where our binding starts. So make sure your edge up here looks nice. Just kind of making sure it's all poked out. Nice and flat there. Sink my needle down, turn. And we're just going to edge stitch along this binding. We're not going to go down the placket on the other side though. All right, I'm going to grab a label, put right here. And here we are going around another curve here. So, you know, I kind of try and make it nice and flat like this. The awl can help hold this down. My seam allowance is pretty narrow right there. Bodice can kind of get wiggly like that. All right, and here we are. It's the center front here. We have this nice curve there. We're just kind of keeping it in that nice curve. Keep it nice and flat. And this is the top of the bodice, so meaning this is the layer that's going to be on top, overlapping on the underside of the other bodice. So, because this one wraps left over right. So I'm going to try and make a nice tidy back stitch right here at the neckline. I'm going to lift up my placket here and just sew my binding right about there, just like that. And then that way when I go to top stitch down my placket here, it'll look like I can continue with this little end stitch here. So I just went right to that fold over edge there. All right, let's see, let's give it a good look here. It's laying pretty flat. This is always the trouble spot right here at the shoulder. This is the back neck right here, and there's the shoulder seam. But it looks pretty good. All right, so we have our neck completely finished right now. We have one placket stitched down, and if you haven't done so already, make sure you stitch this one closed. And if you haven't and you still want to choose between closing your bodice left over right or right over left, now is the time, because we're going to stitch the bodice closed. And for this pattern, we're going to do it left over right. So this one right here is unstitched, and so I'm going to stitch it from the right side so I have some nice stitching and I can see everything. Plus, if I were to stitch it from the back side, you know, I could still probably not see that, so we might as well just stitch it from the right side. So what I'm going to do to make sure I catch the under bodice, the right bodice, is I'm going to just lift this up here and I'm going to lay my folded placket right along the end of the right front bodice there. See that, just like that. All right. And we're going to put lots of pins. Make sure you have your waist nice and lined up. All right, and I'm going to also pin this just closed right here so I don't get any weirdness. So I don't get any weirdness when I turn this corner here, because for the first like ½ inch when we go down this placket here, we're only going to be on the left front bodice and we won't be on the right front bodice for, well, actually almost about 3/4 of an inch there. So, all right, so I'm going to start my stitching where I left off on my neck binding. I'm going to make sure that actually does line up. All right, I'm going to make sure we don't get any torquing. And if you need to give yourself a guide, you can use something like the hair marker like this. I can actually see the ridge, that's why I decided against using it. But you know, you can use something like this to kind of give you a visual guide, or chalk or anything that helps you. You can even maybe iron a line on there. I am taking my pins out because I don't really want to get an accidental like tuck on my fabric going over the pin as my presser foot's pressing it, because this is a few layers, so this really light top layer is going to be bullied really easily by the presser foot. There we go. All right, there we go. So now your make sure that your bodice is completely closed here and that you like the way the stitching looks up there. Here we go. A little thread. We have our bobbin, our bodice, and our bodice is completely closed. No gaping here, right? Here's how it looks on the inside. All right, now we're going to attach our waistband to our bodice. So basically, we're just going to take this waistband and we're going to sew one to the front bodice, right sides together, or however you're planning on sewing your seam and finishing your seam allowance. And we're going to do one to the back as well. I can tell which way is up on mine because I have a one-way fabric design. And so yeah, we're gonna do the waistband to just the front and just the back. match up your center notch to your placket, to the center of your placket. All right, once you're done sewing those waistbands onto your bodice, you want to press that seam up toward the bodice. It's going to be a little tricky right here at the placket, but just do your best. We just want to steer clear of that when we're sewing all of our elastic on. So we'll just make sure we do that when we're sewing the elastic. I'm just going to double check. We don't have any tucks or anything in there. That's looking good. All right, so now we have our waistbands onto our bodice. Now we're going to sew our placket shut on the front skirt. So we're gonna fold our placket a 1/2 inch and then another inch along that notch there. And then we're going to top stitch the right front closed and the left front on top of the right front to close the center front opening. So if you're doing it right over left, you're gonna wanna swap everything that I do right now because I'm gonna be sewing this left over right and we're gonna be sewing the skirt shut at the center front opening. All right, let's get to the iron. So our first step is we're going to turn under a 1/2 inch. And then our next step is we're going to turn it under 1 inch or along that notch. Want a nice even placket. Use some chalk or the hair marker or something similar. Maybe one of those rulers that you can iron on. Anything to make sure you're getting a nice even placket width. I always like to pull like this to make sure if you've cut your fabric on grain, most likely it's going to be pretty easy to get these nice and parallel. All right, so that's our right front. We're going to stitch that one closed first. So let's just set this aside. Okay, so we're going to stitch our right front placket down first. And if you need to give yourself a guide, you can do so on the right side. We're going to stitch it from the top side. And I have a 1 inch guide on my throat plate, so I can just line it up to that. And keep a nice parallel line. You can always stitch this from the back side if you want to, as long as your bobbin thread looks good. I like to kind of hold my fabric like this so that I don't get any diagonal lines or torquing, or I can keep that placket nice and even. There we go. All right, and now we're gonna lay our left front right on top of this. And like before, I'm going to make sure that my placket lines up by putting it like this. So I'm actually going to hold this up and let the placket line up fold edge to fold edge. That way I know I'm going to be stitching it shut. Just like this. And then we can sneak under here and pin it shut. So I'm going to go to the ironing board so I have a larger surface to work on. So I'm going to lay my under front right here, which in this case is the right front. I'm going to lay my top, put it right sides together, and I'm just going to put this placket, just line up those folded edges just like this. Just like this, and very carefully lift this up. If I want, I could put a couple pins in, but I'm going to need to make sure I can get them out really easily. So we'll just put a few like this. All right, now we can flip this over just like that. I'll pull this closer to me a little bit. I can always double check it, make sure if those folds are still staying stacked. All right, now we're gonna put lots of pins in it to keep it secure. When we stitch this closed, you're also going to need to know where the last button ends on your skirt, because we're only going to stitch it closed to that point, and then we're going to pull the under front out of the way and stitch the placket the rest of the way. I'm going to hold it closed right now just to help me until I get it that far. And I'm going to also mark it on here so I know where that spot is. All right, and so now I'm going to double check and make sure my fold is still right on top of the other placket. Pull out these pins. All right, so we're ready to shut. All right, so now let's stitch our placket shut. And if you need to give yourself another mark like a chalk or the hair marker, you can do that as well. I can feel that ridge again. It's very obvious to me, but you can use your little marker or some chalk or something to give yourself a nice straight line and to make sure that you're actually closing up that center front skirt. And again, this layer, for me, this is, a lightweight cotton lawn. It's very lightweight over, 3 layers of placket there. So I'm just going to try and manage that while I try and get a nice straight line. You can see that's where I would get a little tuck over my pin. So we're going to remove the pin. All right, so we're getting down to the opening. Take my pins out here. So now I just need to make sure that I'm going to sweep this out of the way here. I'm just going to pull it pretty hard that way. And now I'm just focused on where that edge is and managing that top layer. You can see I'm kind of sliding it, making sure it's getting fed in there and not sliding down or creating diagonal lines. Here we go. Let's see how that hangs underneath there. I have a little tiny tuck, so maybe I would finesse that if it doesn't hang nice enough. Right now, it's probably not going to bug anything, but if that bugs you, you can kind of finesse that a little bit if you want. All right, and there we go. Our placket is sewn shut, so make sure that it actually is. And now it'll be ready for buttons and when we get to that point. Okay, now we're going to sew our center back seam of the skirt together. All right, you're going to press that seam one direction. All right, now we're going to do the first step of our pockets to our skirts because we're not going to sew the side seams. I just want to say that so you don't accidentally sew your side seam shut because we need it open to do all of our elastic shirring. So we're just going to attach our pockets right now because it's going to be less handling later and it'll be a little easier. So we're going to do the first step. And I'm going to be doing a French seam and seam pockets, but if you're not, just make sure you use just a 1/4 inch seam allowance when you attach your pockets. You're going to line up the notches here on the side, sew it at 1/4 inch seam, press the seam allowance towards the pocket, and stitch that seam allowance like an understitch. All right, so I'm going to do a French seam. So we have 2 pockets to our back, and now we're going to do 2 pockets to our fronts. All right, now we're going to iron all these. There's nothing mysterious about this step when you're doing a French seam and seam pocket. Same thing, we're just going to press the seam allowance one direction, and then we're going to press it along the seam. Okay, so our first step with the French seam and seam pockets was just to sew them on their wrong sides together, and now we're just gonna sew it right sides together in closing that seam, and just make sure that we'll do it pocket side up so we can see. So we're just gonna do it just on the pocket here. straight up. And you're gonna have that seam allowance folding over, and that's fine. We're gonna solve that later. All right, so we're gonna do this other one here. Right sides together, and we'll do all 4 just like this, and then we're ready for the next step of our dress. All right, we're gonna gather our skirt to our waistband. So we're gonna put our stitch length to 4 millimeters, and we're gonna do 2 rows of gathering stitches inside the seam allowance. So make 2 parallel rows, leave nice long tails. And we'll do this for both our front and our back. Make sure all these little threads are towards your raw edge and your seam. All right, we're going to attach our skirts to the bodice or the waistband, gathering them up. And right here, I have my bodice upside down to me here. Here's the neckline right here, and here's the placket. And when we attach our skirt to the bodice, we're not gonna gather right here at the center, kind of matching the width of the placket here. But we don't have, we have a placket on the lower skirt, so it'll be pretty easy to keep it smooth right there. It won't want to gather anyway. All right, so we're gonna line this up at the center here and at the sides. All right, now we're gonna gather each of these 2 sections up. It's not gonna take much gathering. Distribute your gathers evenly. Okay, we put our stitch length back to normal. Get all these threads out of the way. I'm gonna be doing a fake French seam here. I have the waistband and the skirt right sides together. So I'm gonna sew my full seam allowance this time. And I always like to get everything kind of positioned. And I make sure also that my skirt is kind of perpendicular to this edge here. It makes the gathers hang and look a lot nicer. I'm just stitching right to the left of my gathering stitches there. Keep all those raw edges lined up. Keep it perpendicular. Don't let any of these gathers fold over one another and create a tuck. Make sure we're nice and smooth at our placket here. All right, and so let's double check it. Always double check. Make sure you have no raw edges poking out. Your gathers look the way you want them to. So for my fake French seam that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to trim down the layer with the gathers, and then I'm going to fold the waistband over that and kind of hem it over the seam allowance there. So anytime I'm trimming, I always put the layer that I'm trimming on the bottom so that I know it's the only layer that I'll trim, and I won't accidentally trim the wrong layer. So I'm gonna iron my waistband seam over. All right, so I've ironed my seam allowance. I folded it down in half. So here is my seam right here. I trimmed the gathered edge, and I just folded the waistband in half. I'm gonna leave a raw edge there, and it's gonna be completely fine because we're gonna be stitching it down, and that will also secure it. So we're just gonna edge stitch it right into the seam allowance. Get my awl to kind of grab it over here. It got a little misironed there. There we go. Kind of holding it taut while I do it like this. kind of pulling a taut when the needle is down. There we go. And so then that's my seam allowance finish, just like that. And we're gonna press the seam down toward the skirt so we leave all the space for our elastic shirring. And so I'm gonna repeat this for the back waistband now. Same exact steps. All right, we have a dress almost. We just have one big step with the elastic shirring, which is gonna be super fun. I promise it's gonna be really straightforward and easy. And then after that, there's basically side seams and finishing our pockets, hems, and then your buttons, because there's no buttonholes. All right, let's get to it. All right, it's time to add the elastic shirring to our waist, and it's gonna be easy peasy, I promise. So let's just go over a couple of things. You're gonna hand wind your elastic onto your bobbin. So you don't really wanna stretch it on there. You don't want it to be too loose, so you just want some nice even tension. So one of my little tricks that I do when I do something like this, like hand winding, is I try and put the spool of bobbin elastic onto something that'll hold it. It can be anything. It can be a spool on your machine, a spool holder on your machine, or something like this. This is a yarn ball holder. And so I take one end of the elastic and I put it through a hole on my bobbin, just like this. The first couple rounds are the fussiest. So I get it on here and I get it going like this. And then I'm gonna put my awl, or you can put your seam ripper through there. And now I'm just going to spin it like this. And so once this is secure on the bobbin, you can just kind of hold it like this and wind your elastic like this, and it's a little less fussy. You can also spin it like this. It just takes a little longer and sometimes it'll snap back. But just having these two items on something to hold it helps a little bit while you're hand winding. Okay, so when we're marking our rows here, you're gonna need to choose if you want 7 rows or 9 rows of your elastic. The first row is gonna start 1/8 of an inch away from the waistband seam on either side. And then if you wanna do 7 rows, you want those to be about 1/2 inch apart, the rest of your lines. And if you're gonna do 9 rows, you want them about 3/8 of an inch apart. So I'm gonna do 7 rows here, and I used my Choco Liner chalk here, and I used a long ruler. I put it on my ironing board, and then I just made parallel lines using my chalk. So we don't want these markings to disappear while we're sewing. All right, let's get to it. So we're going to use regular thread up top, and we're going to change our stitch length to 3.5 or 4 millimeters. I would do a test to make sure what works for you. So all right, we're going to put the bobbin in there, and I'm going to trim this little elastic tail that's poking out the side there. I don't want that to interrupt my bobbin case at all. Get rid of that. And just put it in your bobbin case just like usual. And one of the keys when you're sewing the bobbin elastic is leaving a tail at either end of your starting and stopping seam, because once the elastic is pulled, like your waistband is pulling, it's going to suck that elastic into the seam. So you need to make sure you allow for that to happen. So make sure you leave a nice long tail, maybe not that long, in your bobbin when you start. And I would do the same on your upper thread as well. All right, so I have a piece of scrap fabric here, and I'm gonna test it out. And I'm even gonna sew the same direction of the grain line because I'm gonna be going on the cross grain on the waistband. I'm gonna do my sample on the cross grain too. All right, so we're gonna start off slow. And I think one other tip that you might wanna do is pull up your elastic through. Most home machines, you do that naturally, but on an industrial, you don't. So I'm just gonna say that. Let's trim those down a little bit. Got like a 4-inch tail. And we're just gonna give it a try. So just start slowly and just see how your machine reacts at first. You're probably gonna be shocked at how easy it really is. All right, so I'm gonna do that much, and I'm not gonna clip my threads using my machine. I'm gonna leave a tail again. And because I'm pulling from the bobbin, see how it snaps in there? So you need to leave it a little longer than you think. The top thread will be probably really long. All right, and let's just look at that. Look at the tension. And once these threads are secured at either end, you know, how do we feel about pulling it? And it feels pretty good. We're also going to do a steaming step on there too, and that really helps this shearing elastic. All right, let's get to it. All right, we have a lot of dress going on here, don't we? So just make sure that you stay pretty methodical with how you're sewing. Don't catch any of your dress underneath, because if you have to run, if you run out of bobbin or something like that, you're probably going to have to rip out that seam and start over again. It'll probably be a better choice to do that. All right, so the first row is 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. And I think that the first and last are probably going to be your trickiest ones. You want your seam allowances pressed away, so make sure that they're pressed away from your waistband. This probably is going to be the trickiest seam, and that's because when we get to this thickness of our placket, your presser foot might get bullied by this placket. So a strategy might be to swap to a zipper foot right before you get there, or use something that levels out your presser foot underneath on this side. So, all right, let's do this. All right, so we're gonna start well into the seam allowance here, like starting at the raw edge. So we just have as much play there as possible and opportunities to deal with our thread tails at the very end. Some machines will let you back tack here, but some might not with the bobbin elastic in there. So we're just gonna leave these nice long tails, so that it can, you know, suck up the elasticity when we stretch it, and also so that we have room to secure our tails. All right, so that first seam is really close to the seam, about 1/8 of an inch away. And we're going to just do a nice, even speed. We have a lot of dress here to manage. All right, so now we're at the thickness of the placket, so we're going to try and do this really slowly and make sure that it doesn't push the presser foot off. There we go. Not too bad. All right, and remember you want a nice long tail here at the end, and it's probably gonna be not as long as you think when you pull it. There we go. And we're gonna do it again. Okay, and so we have these gathers kind of in our way right now, but we're just gonna do our best. It's gonna be a lot easier than you think. So just follow your chalk. If you can still see, I can barely see mine. Make sure your tail is long. And I'm going to start a 1/2 inch away from my last seam. I'm always checking it, making sure that it stretches right when I start, so I don't do the whole seam and it's not stretching, or it's or the bobbin elastic is really tight. If you're going to stretch it like this, make sure you hold the other side. And make sure that you also don't pull on it, pull on your needle. All right, we're just going to continue doing this for the rest of our waistband. All right, we're on that last row. I bet you are thankful you're not doing contrast thread right now like me. But I'm actually liking the way the contrast thread looks with my smocking, or my shearing. All right, so we're gonna push that seam allowance towards the skirt. I'm gonna reach under and make sure that it actually is out of the way. And again, I'm going to rest 1/2 of my presser foot on the seam here. It might be a little closer than the 1/8 of an inch that I need, but it also will be a little easier to sew because it'll maintain an even thickness for the presser foot, because the presser foot really likes having
complete contact front to back with the feed dogs. It's not as critical that one side of the presser foot isn't touching as it is that it's touching front to back evenly. That's what will cause the feed issue. Okay, I'm gonna reach under there. There's so much dress. Okay, we're at that placket again on the skirt. All right. Not too bad, right? Not too bad. I could have been a little more parallel. I was definitely losing some of my chalk lines. In matching thread, though, I really think that this wouldn't be noticeable, any kind of width issues there. And by and large, it looks pretty good. So, all right, let's do our next step with the elastic. Okay, so we're gonna shrink these elastic threads a little bit with some steam. So we're gonna put this wrong side up with the elastic facing up. I'm gonna hover my iron above the shirring, and we're just gonna steam it. Good. All right, so I'm gonna continue on with the back, and I'm gonna do the first couple rows close up under the needle so you can see it nice and close. All right, so here we are on the back. We're gonna make sure that seam allowance is pressed away from the waistband, and I'm gonna start with my presser foot riding on the seam there just to make it a nice even weight or thickness the whole time. We had our long tail. We started in the seam allowance there. And I make sure that it's, drawing up. And it feels pretty good. Sometimes I gotta get it going a little bit by just giving it a little tug. I just have to keep pressing that seam allowance towards the skirt because the gathers want it to do otherwise. First seam's always the hardest. A little wiggly there. All right, home stretch. Make sure to leave your tail. And we're gonna do it again. Just keep going, keep your lines nice and parallel, and check your stretch right at the beginning. Leave a nice long tail. Start in that seam allowance. Backstitch if you can. That is really nice if your machine allows you to do that. All right, now we have our whole dress shirred. So remember to seam your elastic, and then we're gonna do our side seams and finish our dress. All right, so we're gonna sew our side seams now and finish up our dress. So one last little step I'm gonna do just to kind of secure my shirring here is, first of all, give it a little tug. You have long tails, so you can do this so that the elastic, if it has to suck into the dress, it does. So you don't accidentally, once it's stretching, it doesn't pull out of the seam or something like that. So now I'm gonna make sure all of these tails are towards the raw edge, especially the elastic. Sometimes the elastic will fold back into the stitching when you're sewing and you didn't notice it. So just make sure they're all towards there. And I'm just gonna back stitch over these. You can hand tie them. If you back stitched when you sewed your seams, you probably don't have to worry about this. I'm just gonna give mine an extra little security level there. And I'm going to trim this, but I'm also doing French seams, so that's why I'm also feeling pretty confident about this, because the French seams are going to definitely lock it in there. All right, so let's trim this a little more. And we'll do this one. It's a lot of dress, but we're about to make it a really manageable thing here. Okay, and don't forget to put your stitch length back to the regular length for the rest of the sewing. And now we're going to put this either right sides together if you're doing your seam that way, or wrong sides together if you're doing a French seam like me. All right, so we're down to doing our side seams, and so I'm doing a French seam, so my garment is wrong sides together, but if you're doing a different seam finish, make sure you put it right sides together and finish your seam allowance. So with the French seam and the side seam pocket, and give you a little information about that, I'm going to start up here at the sleeve hem, and we're going to just put it wrong sides together, and we're just sewing the seam just like we always do with a French seam. So use the seam allowance you prefer, like your ratio, and we'll sew down. We're going to line up our waistband seam, notches, I'm going to give extra back tacks over these elastic edges here. All right, and so now we're down here at the pocket. So we're going to put this wrong sides together, and we're going to stack this seam here that we've already sewn of the pocket right on top of the other one. So just do your best. Hopefully your pocket's still lining up here. If you don't get it perfectly stacked one on top of the other, it's going to be okay. We can kind of correct any kind of misalignments in the side seam on our last seam. But try your best just to get that seam right on top of the other. You can just stack those seam allowances on top of each other. All right, now right here, we're going to come down just past the seam, our amount of our seam allowance, and then now we're going to leave the needle down and we're going to pivot. And now we're going to sew around the perimeter of the pocket. Now the pocket's always tricky. I don't know why, but I feel like anytime I sew a pocket, there's one little spot that doesn't get sewn. So make sure you have all these edges lined up. It's also a very stretchy little piece because there's a lot of bias happening along this edge. And start taking a peek and making sure this opening right here is flat on both the front and the back. All right, so we've pivoted, keeping those raw edges. It's a tricky little piece. Make sure we're still lined up. All right, now we're coming around, and before I get completely all the way around, we're going to start looking at this alignment because, like I said, it's okay maybe if your seam isn't perfectly stacked up one on top of the other, but what you really do want is that both of these pieces are flat to one another. You wouldn't want one pocket side to be kind of loose and slack and the other one to be nice and flat. So make sure that they're both the same. And you're pressing the seam allowance towards the pocket, by the way. Okay, got this nice and flat. And now when we come around here, we're going to come around and we're going to sew just past this seam, just past, and we're going to pivot. We're basically pivoting on our seam allowance for our first pass French seam. So not at the final French, not at the full seam amount, just the half amount that we're using, or a little less than half. All right, so here we are. Put all that seam allowance towards the pocket, just like that. See, it's looking like that. And I'm gonna go just past that seam, like just a needle width past it. And now we're gonna go straight down. Line up your hem and your notches. For some reason, I always get slightly bigger seam allowance when I do the underside of the pocket. And I think that's just because we're wanting to make sure that we catch everything, and we might tend to be a little bit overzealous there. Those raw edges towards the raw edge and all those threads, because it is pretty thready now that we've been handling this dress for so long. There we go, and now we're going to trim this edge, and when we get right here, we're going to clip into this little corner here, right up to our pivot, just right there. And I would get kind of close, you don't have to go all the way there, and that's it. And then the rest of it we're just going to trim down just like we usually do with the French seam. I'm
Pull the pocket out of the way here, trim that off. Trim a little bit more, just making sure I don't cut my pocket. Now we're going to go around the perimeter of the pocket. Same thing, I'm going to pull my dress out of the way. Just make sure you don't get your dress under there. There's a lot of thicknesses. All right, now we're going to press this just like we always do. Just press it one direction, doesn't matter. Be really firm with it. And then when you get to this pocket here, stick a towel or a ham or something inside there to press this seam. It's going to make it a lot easier. Don't forget to clip that little bottom spot where we pivoted at the bottom of the pocket. Just go right up to the pivot point. Doesn't matter which direction you press this, just press it. Same thing, just stick a towel in there or a ham or something, sleeve board, whatever you have, that'll help you. And do your best here at the side seam. It's a little thick, but even pressing it a little bit is going to help. I'm going to take a slightly larger seam allowance there just to give me more insurance about all the shearing stitches sitting there. All right, so now we're going to turn this inside out, put it right sides together. We're going to do the pocket and the bodice, all of it. This is the easier pressing. It sort of wants to be pressed now. So remember, stack the seam. All right, and then the pocket, that's here. And here's that little pivot point. So because we clipped there, you should get a pretty smooth transition here. If it's looking a little puckery or you're getting some stress lines, maybe clip in there a little bit more. Okay. Remember, we want this nice and flat. You don't want the front to be longer than the back, or vice versa. And get your little pivot point here too. This one's not as severe as the lower one. All right, okay, so we're gonna sew down our side seam, right sides together. Try and be aware of where those seams are hitting one another. But there's a lot going on right there, so the fullness of the fabric is going to probably hide any little bit of misalignments. Let's get rid of this thread right here. All right, so now we're approaching our pocket, and we're going to put our needle right along to next to the seam, so right to the left of that seam. We're going to pivot with the needle down and go around the pocket. I had a little trouble getting close there. I was talking and trying to finagle that and didn't quite get it in the spot I wanted. All right, and so now we're coming along the underside here. So I like to make sure my pocket's nice and flat here so I don't get any weird little, stress lines or anything. I'm holding it all in place. Here's my skirt side seam right here. There's a lot of dress, so I'm also holding all that. And so the same thing, I'm going to come with my needle just past that seam I sewed, but really I'm going to line it up with the seam of the skirt here. So my side seam is really way over here because remember we did a really narrow seam allowance on this pocket opening. So we have some space. And we're going to go past the seam by quite a bit there and line up with our side seam. And this is nice because this means this seam will be kind of tucked into our pocket and it won't be very visible on the outside. That's why we did the narrower seam allowance. All right. right, so our last little step is we're just gonna check our pocket opening and see what we think. Because sometimes the pocket opening can be kind of big, and if it is, we can change that. So let's find our pocket here, and we're just gonna put our hand in there and go, does that feel like a really big opening? It kind of does. So what I'm gonna do is define the opening a little bit. And you can do that by stitching straight down. So what I do is, here's my side seam right here, right? You see that? And what we can do is, because we kind of did a soft pivot here, because we did a little soft pivot here, what we could do is go like this, straighten this down, and maybe just sew to like right there and just stop right there. Right there. And same thing down here. When I choke up the opening of a pocket, usually I do most of the adjustment from the bottom up. That way I get more depth to my pocket bag and it's more secure for the contents that's in there. Because if you keep the opening really low, then it's too close to the what's ever in your pocket. So what you want to do is kind of make it more of a drop, right? So we can kind of put our hand in there and go, all right, let's give us a little bit of a buffer. And then we can choke this up quite a bit and go as far as we want. All right, so let's line this up a little better down here or up here. I'm still pulling it all apart and making it nice and flat. There we go. So now we have this more of a definition right here. It's stopping right there. And and I still make sure my pocket's nice and flat here. And theoretically, this line needs to line up with this one, but here's the deal. 2 points make a straight line. So even if this one was way over here and this one was over here, that's gonna line up, right? So don't sweat it too much. It's gonna line up, and we're not really that far off anyway. There we go. So now we have a little bit more pocket definition. If you feel like that's too much, you know, you get to wearing this a few times and you think, oh, that's just too small of an opening, you can just unpick some of these stitches. And I would unpick, well, this one I would probably leave because we're really close to the top. Just unpick a few stitches and put a new back tack in. So you can kind of try it out. Let's get a smoother transition there. All right, so we're going to repeat for the other side, and then now we're going to do our hems. Home stretch. All right, we're just going to hem our sleeves and our skirt and do our buttons. All right, so we're just going to do a 1/2 inch turn twice on this. And if you want to pre-iron or not, you don't have to. So we're going to press our seam allowance on the shoulder towards the back and the seam allowance on the side seam to the back. All right, so for the skirt hem, the one thing you want to make sure is that your skirt hem right here at the center front is matching. So make sure that your placket here is lined up at the bottom. And if not, make sure you trim it to match. You can see mine's a little long on one side, I think. All right, and same thing, we're going to do a 1/2 inch turn twice. So you can hem this from the right side or from the underside, depending on what you're most comfortable with. I don't have a free arm machine, so I always, because my machine is flat to the table, I always put my garment inside out when I do things like this. I always start at the underarm, hide my back tack there. So sometimes with these placket openings, I'll do some like tricksy folding where I'll fold down a corner, fold it up, and then fold it like this. I really like it when the stitching lines up. I can turn the corner here, but this placket's not quite like that. So we're just gonna go straight
across to the center front right here, to the center front edge of the placket. But I'm also gonna sew up along this edge here. I really don't like it when this little folded edge peeks out, you know, sneaks out over time. So I'm just gonna secure it right there. I'm gonna turn 90 degrees, and then we're gonna sew our whole hem right along the edge of that fold. Press my seams to the back, and I made sure that my center back seam was pressed the same way at the waistband as it is at the hem. All right, so here we are at the front, and we're gonna make sure again that our center fronts are gonna match right now. So I've got my front of my dress here, and it's stitched down right there, so it's pretty easy to kind of make sure how it's gonna line up right here. And this fold looks a little too much. You can see that fold goes past it, so we'll line up right here is where we want our final fold to be, right here. And so now I've got this, and I'm actually gonna pin it right on that edge so I don't lose it. And now tuck this in, pull out my pin and hold it, tuck that in a little nicer. And then you can see that my little fold is peeking out right here. So I'm gonna fold it in just a tiny bit. Just gonna fold like a little triangle in there, just like that. And when I get to the end, I'm gonna turn and I'm gonna back up to the bottom and finish right there. All right, and now we're gonna do our buttons. I'm gonna give you some tips on sewing on your buttons, especially the placement. So with your pattern, what I would do is find your size in these circles. It may be a little hard to determine, but you can count the lines and find your size. And then poke a hole in the middle of each one of those circles. There's mine right here. And I would do this on your bodice and on your skirt. And then we're gonna line up our template, and we're gonna line up the fold with the fold of our placket here. And let's just fold this like this. So I'm gonna fold up my bodice so it's not in the way here. And so you can see here's my placket, and here, right here is the holes. So I'll show you in red here that I punched through on the pattern. So we're gonna line up this fold edge to the fold of our placket here, and we're gonna hang it off the seam allowance that we used at the hem or the waistband there, which is a 1/2 inch. And it should hang off at the top, the seam allowance at the top there, just like that. And now you can use these holes, and I'm gonna just use one of these ultra washable markers. They work really good. And make my hole a little bit more pronounced like this. We're gonna sew our button right on this ink, and this is washable, so it's gonna be fine. Just like that. And we'll do that on the skirt too. You can see here is my button marking there, there, and right there. Of course, it landed right on a branch, right? And now you can sew your buttons on. Because your bodice doesn't open, you don't really need a thread shank on your buttons. So you can use your machine to sew these on, which is great, unless you're using shank buttons. And you just do that all the way down the front of your dress, and you're done. Good job. Thanks for sewing with me today. I'm Sarah, and I hope you enjoyed the sew along.